You're listening to Campaign 2012, a podcast from the Brookings Institution.
Give us a sense of the lay of the land on climate in the campaign. It's a pretty bleak landscape as an issue that people are talking about. But is there any discussion of it of any consequence, and what does it look like to the extent it exists?
I think there's I wouldn't say there's no discussion. There's always a little bit of discussion on environmental policies and climate in particular. The thing that always discourages me is there are politically easier things one can do, policies one can promulgate or propose on climate that I just don't think are nearly as effective. And so unfortunately what you have now, the effective ones, which I think a cap and trade program or my preferred policy, a carbon tax program, I think either of those would give you a price on carbon and actually send the proper incentives through the market economy to actually successfully and at reasonable cost reduce these emissions. Those are the key proposals that I've always been looking for, and they're very rare. And the reason why they're rare is because people start getting concerned about taxation and what this is going to cost. As a result, you wind up with policies that are in some sense not as salient. In my view, they're not as effective, and they actually wind up having substantial costs, especially given that they're not very effective. Why spend money on something that's not effective? So you always get bubblings of that, and I think we've seen that over the last 3 years, and I think in the Obama administration, this was kind of where they're pushing now. I mean, in the sense that climate policy is politically unpopular. Cap and trade is something you don't hear from any candidates' mouths these days. So instead, you get promotion for green jobs, or you get loan guarantees, or you get these other policies, other subsidies. Again, you can make a political platform on that, and it's not to say they do zero good. I just don't think they're going to be in the end very effective. So we have seen some of that, as you kind of always do, especially from the Democratic Party in these in most campaigns. But even the Republican Party, President Bush didn't do cap and trade. He stayed away from cap. I should say he did do cap and trade and propose it for other pollutants, but he certainly stayed away from it for greenhouse gases. But he had other things. He had a hydrogen economy. He had other subsidies. They didn't amount to a lot, and in my view, they're not very effective, but they're more politically palatable. And I think we see more of the same in that sense.
So economists have been talking about, putting a price on carbon as the sort of gold standard of effectiveness in this area for a long time.
Sure.
The political system is not terribly receptive to it. Obama comes in, having spoken about this issue a lot, with a granted seeming greater consensus than there really was, given who he was running against, but some degree of bipartisan support for the idea. And yet 3 years later, 3.5 years later, we are looking at a lot of sort of small ball stuff that is, as you say, less effective, less efficient. Is the original sin in the House bill that passed? Where did that go wrong?
Sure. Well, there's always lots of sinners to point out. I think it's good to step back. You're right. Economists have been proposing cap and trade or carbon tax or pollution taxes more broadly for pollution reduction, not just carbon, not just greenhouse gases, since the 60s.
It comes from, right, it was implemented in sulfur dioxide.
And so sulfur dioxide was implemented. This was kind of the heyday for environmental economists. The heyday was the 1990 Clean Air Act, which implemented a cap and trade. There was a lot of reservations about it, whether it would work. But in some sense, the economists won the day. And we had a cap and trade program for sulfur dioxide, which were the pollutant for acid rain, contributing to acid rain. It's been enormously successful. Not only did we meet the caps, we met them kind of early. We were getting fast reductions, and the costs of the program are much less than were even projected at the time. So it in some sense, worked like the textbook. It wasn't perfect. I could have tinkered with some of the features of it, but by and large, it was an enormously it's a case study for an enormously successful environmental policy. So you're right, and then as I said earlier, when you looked at President Bush, so this was the first President Bush who was in 1990 for the sulfur dioxide cap and trade. The second President Bush, George W. Bush, actually did propose cap and trade for other pollutants and for ramping down the sulfur dioxide one. So he was cap and trade friendly in some sense. But yet, here we are. We actually had the president proposing a cap and trade. We had the Republican nominee 4 years proposing a cap and trade, and cap and trade, in some sense, crashed and burned politically. Why is that? Well, there's a few things. As I alluded to earlier, we're looking at a recession, and so people are just hesitant. So regardless of the mechanism, whether it's cap and trade or other things, you have to ask the question, well, what are the benefits, what are the costs? Is the electorate with you from an economic point of view? I think the economics of it makes sense given the benefits of this, but that is still a job that you need buy-in on. The SO2 program was enormously successful, but SO2 is a kind of in some sense, a small issue compared to global climate change, which is going to really have broader reverberations. The discouraging part for me from the Republican side of view is instead of making the argument that this isn't the time or maybe it's not even worth the cost, they actually kind of ganged up on the cap and trade itself. So if you think that this is any pollutant, if you have any pollutant that you are interested in reducing, cap and trade is the way to do it, or a tax, or not through mandates, not through subsidies. And unfortunately, the Republicans didn't argue about the mandates and subsidies. They kind of embraced those, and they did under the previous administration to some extent as well. So I get discouraged that on the Republican side, that in some sense they've kind of tarred cap and trade, and the one market mechanism that's been shown to be successful for pollution reduction, they've now cursed. Well, if you want pollution reduction and you're cursing the market mechanism, then the result is going to be much more costly, less economically efficient mechanisms of doing that. And I think that, again, for political reasons, it was easy to call it cap and tax, and people run from a tax, but you wind up hurting the cause, because in the end, sure, people don't run so much from subsidies and mandates, but they're actually more costly and less effective.
And so let's talk about the subsidies and regulatory mandates and what they've been and to what extent they've been ineffective. I mean, the president loves to talk about green jobs, sure, and there are all these new regulatory requirements about light bulbs and, right, and cafe standards and whatnot. And what's wrong with that as a policy matter?
Well, first I should say it's understandable when you view a problem of, let's say, climate change or any pollution problem, and then something is taken off the table, you go to what you think is the next best. And especially if that is much more politically appealing. What I think is unfortunate is we wind up, I think we need more leadership here across administrations, we wind up going for the more politically appealing, the things that are easier to pass, subsidies, mandates, instead of the things that I think are really effective. And there's this kind of old adage, there's a problem, something must be done. Well, this is something, so therefore let's do it. And sometimes you wind up doing things that I think that are ineffective, and in some sense you kind of squeeze the oxygen out of the ability to actually pivot sometimes to the effective things. If you kind of ring the bell and make an announcement, look, I just did climate policy, but it's all these things that really don't amount to much, you're foregoing the opportunity to do something like putting a price on carbon that I think is really what you need to do. The problems I have with things like mandates and loan guarantees and subsidies and all of that, I think they're numerous. I mean, if you look at something like mandates, you're not putting a price on carbon. What you're trying to do is you're trying to increase the efficiency, the fuel efficiency or energy efficiency of appliances. You're basically saying, okay, all dishwashers have to run at this efficiency, or all clothes washers have to run at this efficiency, or fuel economy standards for cars. And in actual fact, if you actually look at the agencies that are proposing and promulgating these rules, if you look at their analyses, you read it, the analysis say, you don't get a lot of environmental benefits from these. In fact, if you look at the costs and you look at the environmental benefits, the costs heavily outweigh the environmental benefits. And this is from the own agency analysis. The one thing they do say is, oh, but there's a lot of benefits here because here consumers are buying appliances that, sure, they're cheaper when you buy them, but they cost you in the long run because they're less fuel efficient. We're saving you money by forcing you to actually switch to this more fuel efficient economy. So I actually find that result, I'm very skeptical about the results. I have a lot of concerns about what, their claims that they're saving me money. But put that aside for a second. What you've done is you've turned environmental policy into consumer protection. And you can argue, I think it's a bad use of a regulatory dollar, but even if you think that's good, at the end of the day, by the agency's own standards, you're really not reducing pollution. They claim you're saving me money on my gas bill or my electric bill, but it's really de minimis what the environmental, the climate benefits are. And so then, by their own admission, you're really not doing that much. Again, politically, something like a fuel economy standard is a lot easier to pass than a tax on gasoline, even though in some sense they're sort of the same thing. In my view, a tax on gasoline is more effective, because if you were to tax my gasoline, then I'll decide whether or not should I really be driving now when it's rush hour. Maybe I should wait a little bit. Should I take this long trip? Maybe I should take a bus or a train instead. If you just force me into a fuel economy car, the next day I've got this new car that's highly fuel efficient. Well, heck, I might as well drive, because look, I'm saving money now. And so it's not actually getting at the margin that you want. And so the environmental benefits as a result, I think, are very limited.
So you've covered a little bit of this ground already, but I'm like to talk a little bit about your recommendations for the next administration. Sure. In the paper, you describe them very modestly as sort of something that may be promising terrain in an area in which, you know, nobody wants to talk about this issue anymore. And instead of binding it to consumer policy or binding it to you know, sort of a regulatory policy, you bind it to fiscal policy. Yeah. Is that the magic bullet? And what is it? Give us a sense of the sort of broad scope of the recommendations.
Yeah. So my recommendations are you alluded to this. I don't know if I didn't probability weight them on the likelihood of success. And again, no pun intended, the climate that we're in now, the political climate we're in now, doesn't give one that much hope that at least in the short term that you're going to be looking at much movement on this issue. What I tried to do in the paper is try and kind of take the reasonable reasonable positions from both sides and say, where can we find some compromise? And I think there's two avenues of compromise. One, as I already alluded to, we need fiscal reform, and particularly we need tax reform. Our tax system is highly inefficient, it's complex, it's got things phasing out, so it gives you all sorts of uncertainty. In many ways it's unfair, and it's not generating the revenue that, even from a conservative point of view, what you would need to come to a reasonable fiscally balanced outlook. So within that, there's lots of ways you can do it. And I do see things like Simpson-Bowles and the diminished Rivlin plans as having broad consensus. They weren't the exact same plans, but they looked at broadening the tax base and lowering tax rates. And in the diminished Rivlin plan, they looked at essentially a consumption tax on top of that and other revenue sources there. But there is, I think, a large degree of consensus. And so to the extent that we're going to, at some point, one hopes soon, I would say not this year, but post-election, start seriously taking on tax reform and the fiscal issues, I think that is an avenue potential avenue of compromise between right and left. As I said, Republicans faced with the decision of raising tax revenues through the income tax or raising tax revenues through taxing pollution, I would think and hope would pick the latter. So as in kind of one of the chips that goes into going big or whatever they come up with, I think there's some scope for that. I don't know if it's likely. I think, as we saw with Simpson-Bowles, the more kind of additional taxes you add, the harder the negotiation space becomes. So in some sense, it's very easy to just say, let's look at the income tax and say, well, okay, we can lower rates and broaden the base within the income tax, and look what we've got. And we can negotiate where the right is saying, let's lower rates, and the left is saying, no, let's raise rates, and the right, and so you can kind of, you got, two levers to switch and two different sides, and I think you can actually negotiate on that. So throwing in something like a carbon tax or even a VAT, value-added tax, is a little bit complicated, but I don't think, from an economic point of view, you can make a very cogent argument, as I do, for it, and I think there's some potential scope for negotiation. The other thing I introduced in the paper, which really hasn't been talked about, in the absence of the cap-and-trade bill, of a climate bill, stemming from a ruling from the Supreme Court from a few years ago, EPA is moving forward with regulating greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act has been around since 1970, which, quite honestly, is terribly equipped to actually tackle this issue. But, you got a Supreme Court ruling, you got the EPA moving forward, this thing is going to be potentially costly, and I don't think that effective. But there's been, as a result, a lot of opposition, especially on the right, saying, oh, here we go, you're regulating us again, this is going to affect us all, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there is some opportunity, and I should say that's been conflated with EPA regulations more broadly, not just on climate issues and everything. It's just become a campaign issue, and we're overregulated, especially in a weak economy. This, I think, has some salience. So the other idea for compromise is, you know what, if you have a cap and trade, or in my view, my preferred option, a carbon tax, one, you don't need these other things, because if you cap emissions, why do you need to do all these other, why do you have to go sector by sector and kind of prescribe technologies or caps for each sector? You've got an overall cap. So it could substitute for that. And additionally, if you cap carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to get other environmental benefits. So a lot of these regulations that the EPA is doing now for other pollutants, some of which aren't going to be nearly as important. And so there's some, I think, flexibility or wiggle room there to say, for a trade, say this is the biggest environmental problem we have now. This will be costly, but it's worth it. And oh, by the way, if we do this, we don't have to do all these other things you're complaining about. Or I wouldn't say all of them, but we don't have to do as much as these other things that you're complaining about. Maybe there's a scope for negotiation there. That's a huge animal to tackle, and there's a lot of vested interest, and a lot of people are very passionate about it. So I don't think that is like off the shelf. There's a lot of work that needs to be done for that. But I offer it as yet another kind of space where you might be able to see some negotiation and moving forward. Again, bringing in the right or bringing in the conservatives, saying, okay, we hear you on these other issues. Here's a way to kind of alleviate some of that in exchange for a carbon tax, for example.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the interview. Appreciate it.
For more information about the paper discussed here or the Campaign 2012 project, please visit our website at www.brookings.edu/campaign2012.